Joining me right now in a First on Fox Business interview, Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin. Secretary, good to see you. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Good morning. It's good to see you as well, Maria.
Can you walk through the plans in terms of rolling back the regulations? What is most important in terms of your goals, ultimately, to move the needle on economic growth and create jobs?
Well, we're very excited. We delivered the report yesterday to the President, as you can see. It's quite extensive. It goes through a lot of recommendations and what we think needs to be done. And the good thing about this is we can get a lot of this done on a regulatory basis. Although some of this needs legislation, there's an enormous amount we can do working with the regulators. And this is fundamentally about making sure that community banks and regional banks can lend and that they have access to capital. This is really what's driving the growth in our economy, what's driving lending to small and medium-sized businesses. Approximately 50% of the assets in the banking system here are in the top 8 banks, and we want to make sure that the rest of the banking system can grow accordingly. And again, this is about proper regulation, but prudent regulation. And we just think we've gone too far with Dodd-Frank after the financial crisis. So this is rolling back these reforms so that community banks, regional banks can thrive and people can get mortgages and loans.
So the regulators are re-examining a litany of capital and liquidity rules. In other words, the capital and liquidity rules were so onerous that it put a limit to the amount of lending that was happening at the smaller and mid-cap banks.
Well, I think the good news is our banking system has recapitalized significantly. So this is about finding the right balance between regulatory reform and making sure in no way we put taxpayers at risk. And particularly for small banks, regional banks, community banks, the regulatory burden has just become too expensive and unnecessary, and we don't need a one-size-fits-all regulatory approach.
And you're saying most of this can be done just through the regulatory process, and you don't need Congress's okay. You don't need actually to turn this into a debate.
Well, we can get a lot of it done working with the regulators, working through FSOC and other areas. You know, we appreciate Chairman Hensarling's approach to the Choice Act, and we look forward to legislation going through the Senate. But we're very focused on what we can do by executive action and what we can do working with the regulators. And we think we can unlock a big part of the community banking system and regional banks on these reforms.
Secretary, let's talk a little about the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Obviously, that was a central part of Dodd-Frank. But you're proposing that the Bureau lose its authority to examine financial firms on a continuing basis. Was this just more bureaucracy with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau?
I think that's right, Maria. And let's start with this is one of the few regulators that at the moment can't be removed by the President and at the moment doesn't have a board to oversee it. So I think, you know, there's litigation about this. We think it's improper. We think it's also improper that this is funded out of the Fed. We think this should be funded by Congress like other congressional appropriations. This agency should be subject to proper review and not subject to one person acting on their own.
Why not just shut it down? I mean, you know, when President Obama was putting this in place, there was a lot of talk about just this, that it was bureaucratic, that there was too much red tape, it wasn't really doing anything. So do you just make it that it can't do anything, or why not just shut it down?
Well, again, I think over time we'll consider whether it should be independent or whether it should be merged with another agency for efficiency. I think we're focused on what the biggest problems are, and the biggest problems are right now it needs proper oversight, and it needs to be an independent regulator like other independent regulators. The budget's gotten way out of control. The bureaucracy has gotten out of control, and this is something that we are going to have to work with Congress on, and we look forward to working with them.
Let me ask you about something that you just said, and that is that the banking sector today is so much better capitalized than when the financial crisis first hit, obviously, with all of the rules put in place, like the stress test, like forcing the banks to raise capital and sit on more capital than certainly the larger banks really wanted to. What do you say to those people to say, yeah, That's why the banking sector is so well capitalized today. We don't want to take away those safeguards. We don't want to take away too many regulations because we want to make sure that they are well capitalized in order to handle another 2008.
Well, Maria, our banks are the best capitalized in the world, and we want to keep them that way. And as I said, we believe in proper regulation, so we're continuing to recommend stress tests. We're just raising the bar on the level of stress tests so that small community banks, small credit unions don't need to have the same bureaucracy. And we're really focused on how often they're done and what the process is. So that's really the issue, and that's what we're focused on.